Hey, everybody. Well, let's take a look at export promotion, the second strategy the developing nations could use to promote economic growth and development in their particular country. So, export promotion, what is it? It's often called export-led growth or an inward-oriented growth strategy based on openness and increased international trade. But the basic idea here, I like to make it simple, right? Increased trade for growth. That's the idea of export promotion, promoting the things that you have in your country in order to lead to growth. So you're getting other countries interested in your products, and that is obviously outward-oriented growth strategy. And economic growth, therefore, is achieved by concentrating on increasing exports. Of course, that would lead to an increase in flow of money and export revenue, which I just said, as a leading factor in the aggregate demand of a country. So the idea here is that increased exports should equal increased gross domestic product, which should equal higher incomes from which would equal growth. So increased exports, increased GDP, higher incomes, more growth, right? And it promotes this idea that countries are going to concentrate on producing and exporting products in which it has a comparative advantage. However, of course, there are certain policies that must be in place in order to achieve this export growth. So let's take a look at those. What will they need to do? And if you think about these things, they're all play into the sort of neoclassical open markets, free markets ideology of how to increase gross domestic product. So in order to achieve this, that being export promotion, it's assumed that a country will need to adopt certain policies. Liberalizing trade, in other words, opening up domestic markets to foreign competition in order to gain foreign access to foreign markets. Now, if you're a developing nation and you open up to foreign competition, that could be a problem. I want you to see the flip side of all these things. Liberalize capital flows. That's a fancy way of saying there will be reduced restrictions on foreign direct investment, so multinational corporations will be more likely to invest in your country. That could cause problems, but it also leads to export promotion. There's also going to be the idea that there's a floating exchange rate. That is an expectation. Also, that investment in the provision of infrastructure to enable trade to take place. Remember, you got to have good roads, good bridges, good ports, good distribution centers in order for trade to take place. And then also a deregulation and minimal government intervention. So these things here, right? These things here, that's not the color I wanted. These things here, liberalized trade, liberalized capital flows, floating exchange rate, investment and provision of infrastructure, deregulation, is a list, and this is super helpful for you for your evaluation purposes, right? This is a list or a package of policies associated with export-led growth. So make sure you have these in your mind. They make sense. This is just basic free trade stuff. It's not that complicated. But this is a nice way of grouping it together in one thing. However, there are some differences between primary and manufactured products for the engine of growth. So here it is okay, so developing countries want to attempt to improve their exports. But what should they do? Should they do either primary products, which of course are things that they grow, or manufactured products? And the thing is that you got to really consider, if you're a country, and this is why there's no right answer here, what's best for your particular country, not necessarily best for others. Or if you look at other examples, it might not be that you could achieve that. And so what am I talking about? Well, it's difficult. Economic growth, or using primary goods as export promotion, is difficult. And many developing countries actually depend on the export of primary markets in order to gain this revenue. But here's the thing. The overall trend in primary product prices, with maybe the exception, I guess, of oil and metals, has been downward. Prices are going down. And that's because of the increased supply and relatively insignificant increases in demand. So this combined with increased protectionism by developed country means that export-led growth based on exporting primary products is very difficult to achieve. So if you're a country like Nicaragua, this is bad news. It's super bad news because you're a long way from being industrialized. So that makes it difficult for you to do export-led growth. Where it has proven successful, and Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan are good examples of these, is that when export led growth is focused on manufactured products, there is success, and and these countries have exported products in which they had a comparative advantage, which was usually, at least in the beginning, based on low cost of labor, and they're obviously super successful in doing it. And what they were doing is they're saying, hey, we have a comparative advantage, right? And over time, the type of product being exported by the majority of these countries has also tended to change from products that were produced using labor-intensive production policies, or methods rather, with low skill levels needed, to more sophisticated products using capital-intensive production methods and more highly skilled workers. Improvements in the education system, of course, were critical for this. And Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan are like these incredibly successful development stories. And it came from the fact that they found what they could do well, and then they became really good at it. Okay, but in terms of a country that has primarily primary goods, this is a difficult strategy for them to take advantage of, because what's proven successful are these manufactured goods. So then there's some problems, right? Like what are the problems with export promotion? It would appear that it's pretty easy to be successful, but one of the things that has happened as a result is, like, you got to realize that the powerful countries are going to react to this. Just because, like, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, like, emerged as these developing nations, and created this export growth, the big people, the big players, they're going to respond. And one of the ways in which the developed world responded to this success was increased protectionism in developed nations against these manufactured products. I know one thing in my childhood, like, Japanese-made electronics showed up in the United States and nearly wiped out the entire electronics business. And there were big calls for tariffs to be put up to protect U.S. Firms from the importation of high-quality electronic products, mainly from Japan at that time. So that's just a normal reaction, because politicians, if there's a lot of imports from another country, that's going to put the domestic firms out of business, and that's going to make politicians go, oh, wait a second here, maybe I could gain office if I start promoting, like, tariffs. I know it's bad in the long run, and I'm like an economist and everything, but I can get elected. And then you see situations where the short run overruns the needs of the long run. Okay. So the other thing is that there's certain assumptions that were made about the necessary conditions for manufactured-led export growth. And what I mean by this is it took, if you look at successful countries, these conditions were not necessarily met, right? And many economists would argue that the role of the state in successful export-led growth is vital, and that minimizing government intervention is not the way forward. And so many of the countries that I mentioned, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and whatnot, the governments played an enormous role in providing infrastructure, subsidizing certain products, creating low credit via central banks, and promoting savings. So it's not like they were all like free markets in there. No, the governments played a huge role, and you could argue, like, well, that's what governments are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to do this. They're supposed to create their own industries, and look at the change they've made in their population's lives by promoting these things. The other thing that can happen by export promotion is multinational corporations can show up, right? And there's always the fear that they may become too powerful in a particular country. And if that's the case, then there'll be some politician who's going to come along and say, hey, we shouldn't have all these multinational corporations in here. What about our local culture and our local traditions? And lastly, massive growth can lead to massive inequality. And you can always say, like, economic growth may be achieved at the expense of economic development. And that's a pretty compelling argument, I have to say. Right? That's true. It works out that way. Sometimes. Not always. But in the long run, growth equals development. But in the short run, which is where most people live, and that's how politicians keep their jobs, is getting reelected, it might be difficult to promote development while you are focusing on growth. All right, my friends, I hope you found this video to be helpful. Check out the next video on trade liberalization for a continued discussion on the international trade strategies of developing nations to promote growth and development. All right, talk to you in a bit.